Thanks, Lauren. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to lead this next conversation. Environmental activist and MacArthur Fellow Catherine Coleman Flowers grew up in Lowndes County, Alabama, an area near the southern state's capital that is plagued by poverty and failing infrastructure. It's a place where it's all too common to find raw sewage seeping into yards and waterways, or to experience contaminated drinking water flowing out of taps, especially in predominantly Black neighborhoods. As the founding director of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, Catherine Coleman Flowers is building partnerships to address this systemic issue. The mission: identify and champion solutions to the intersecting challenges of water and sanitation infrastructure, public health, and economic development. Flowers is a former history teacher, and she writes frequently about waste infrastructure and environmental justice. Her first book, Waste: One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret, came out in November 2020. Catherine, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Heather.
Yeah. So let's start with some context. What is America's dirty secret?
Well, America's dirty secret is that the fact that we're one of the wealthiest countries, if not the wealthiest country in the world, and we have conditions here that people generally expect to see in underdeveloped nations. So that is our dirty secret, that there's a lack of infrastructure or sustainable infrastructure that exists through communities throughout the United States, but certainly Lowndes County has been the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah, and I think you've written, obviously, this being your home, you've written a lot about it. So can you tell me though, where is this rural communities, is urban communities? I think that also deserves some attention.
Yes, it's primarily, we've seen it primarily in rural communities. However, um, first of all, let me tell you about Lowndes County, then I'll
Yeah.
tell you about the wider problem. Lowndes County is located between Selma and Montgomery. And most people know about the significance of that area because of its significance to voting rights. So most of the Selma to Montgomery march goes through Lowndes County. Also, Lowndes County was where people organized their own political party, which was known as the Black Panther Party, which is the original Black Panther Party, although California gets credit for it. But it actually started in rural Lowndes County where sharecroppers organized for the right to vote. And out of that has grown a new movement around sanitation. When I went back home, which is where I'm from originally, and found out that people were living without um, sanitation, they were straight piping when they flushed their toilets. It was going straight out on the ground, still is. And we also found that people were being criminalized. And I think what brought it to the international attention was that we did a parasite study and found evidence of hookworm and other tropical parasites. But since that time, we found out it's a rural problem, but it's bigger than that. We've actually partnered with the Guardian, where we're asking people to self-report around the country. And we have, I've gone to places like Centerville in Illinois that has a wastewater problem. I saw more raw sewage on the ground there, and they're just outside of St. Louis, than I've seen in Lowndes County. Likewise, it is happening in places like Mount Vernon, New York, which is in Westchester County, one of the wealthiest counties in New York. So a lot of it is failed infrastructure, but I think the common thread in it is that we're finding it in communities of color, and we're finding it in rural communities, but we're also finding it in marginalized communities like in Martin County, Kentucky.
Yeah. How is climate change exacerbating the situation?
Well, climate change is exacerbating the situation because the infrastructure that is just simply not working. Even we found that even people, I mean, I've talked about people that are straight piping, but in places like Mount Vernon, New York, and Centerville, the infrastructure has failed. And no longer can we say that it's simply because people don't know how to maintain these systems. It's hard to maintain systems when you're in Alaska and the permafrost is melting and the infrastructure is being exposed. Or as NOAA just recently announced, that it's getting drier in the west but wetter in the east. And we know that whenever there's lots of rain, there's more failures. And then with sea level rise, when they think about sea level rise, they think about the coastal areas, but they don't talk about the fact that groundwater levels are also rising. And when groundwater levels rise, it makes it harder to treat sewage the way we have been doing it. We have to come up with a new way to do it. Otherwise, we're going to have more diseases that we tend to see in more subtropical areas. We're going to start seeing them in areas like COVID has just taught us that. We
Hmm.
can't ignore that anymore because all of these things come together and climate change is a magnifier.
Yeah. I think many of us think, you keep saying infrastructure, infrastructure, right? So I think many of us think of infrastructure as the responsibility of government entities, whether that's a municipality, a state, a county, a federal system, whatever. So why is that mode of thinking outdated? Why do
It's
we?
outdated because, first of all, most of the United States is rural. Most of the United States is unincorporated. Most people live in the cities, but there are people that do live in rural communities, and they're also taxpayers, and they should not be excluded. And I believe that what has happened is that when policy is written, it's written to exclude rural communities. I think that we should employ a rural lexicon. And a rural lexicon means that when the policy is written for where the money can go, that it also go to these rural communities that may not have towns. They may not be organized like municipalities, but they are within the state and they are within a county. So we need to look at how we have actually unintentionally excluded rural communities from having access to these solutions. And then the other part of it is we have found that in these more urban settings that racial covenants have played a role in terms of who's had access to infrastructure. I'm talking about wastewater sanitation infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hearing from people in utilities now that they don't care about. This is just, the most asinine thing I've heard. If you care about the environment and climate, how can you say you don't care about um, sewer because you don't make money off sewer, you make money selling water. But of course, if we don't have adequate treatment of our sanitation, of our sewage, what comes from our bodies, then we're going to have more diseases. And I don't know about everybody else, but I'm tired of the coronavirus, and I hope to never see it happen again. I hope that we never have to deal with anything like that for another 200 or 300 years. But if we don't deal with having infrastructure that is resilient, I'm talking about wastewater treatment infrastructure that's resilient, we're going to see more and more of these kinds of problems.
Yeah. So I want to ask two things here. One is, can you give me an example of a rural area that is addressing this in an effective way?
I haven't seen that
Hmm.
because we
Hmm.
got to keep in mind we just recently started acknowledging that climate change is real.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these places that are having problems don't even acknowledge climate change. And then the other part of it is that in the profession that sells these systems, they're not acknowledging that they're failing. They're
Mm-hmm.
failing across the country. We
Yeah.
don't even have in this country a database that has information on all 50 states and territories about where wastewater systems are failing, who doesn't have them. We have nothing like that. So our organization, the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, is actually embarked on a year-long project with the Guardian, where we're actually collecting that information so there could be a central database
Mhm.
and I think that will help policymakers make decisions. But the bottom line is that we didn't even acknowledge there was hookworm until we did the study. So now we're at a point where we have to acknowledge that our sanitation infrastructure is failing. And it's not because people couldn't maintain it. It's not because they're not educated, because these are the excuses we hear from the people that create these systems. But we also don't have in place anything where they have to, like if you buy a car and the car keeps breaking down and if there's a series of problems with that car, eventually people start buying that car.
Yeah.
Well, in this case, the government is making people buy these entities that don't work. So there's no type of incentive for research and development to improve, and that's one of the things that we're pushing for.
Yeah, it sounds like a kind of a shout out to the businesses in the audience here, but especially those ones with data gathering expertise. So that brings me to my next question, which is how does the business community get involved in helping this? You've mentioned the role of citizen science, right, and communities self-reporting and being involved. What should the nature of business involvement be, whether that's a utility or a company that addresses or that just employs people in that community, for
Well,
example?
I think the first thing that needs to happen, we need to shift the engineering paradigm. The
Hmm.
engineering paradigm should include people from these impacted communities sitting at the table to
Hmm.
help design the solutions. And I think that's part of the environmental justice approach. but I think it's also the best way to come up with long-term solutions, because generally the people that are engineering or designing solutions aren't working in these communities. So when they fail, they don't know why they fail or how it impacts families. And oftentimes they dismiss it and say, oh, it's because you couldn't maintain the system. But we also have to keep in mind that there's some factors now that were not around 5, 10 years ago that are influencing this. And the people that are suffering should be the ones sitting at the table. So what we're planning to do through our organization is we're bringing together collaborators. If there are business people out there that are interested in being part of our collaboration, we're bringing people from these communities together with people from hopefully the Department of Defense and NASA to come up with ways to treat wastewater to drinking water quality. We like to retire sewers, period. Because sewers at the end of the day end up in rivers and streams and cause fish kills and algae blooms and contaminate water. So if we can treat drinking water we can treat sewers to drinking water quality in outer space, why can't we do that here on Earth? And that's our goal as the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. And that's our solution to the problem. I'm inspired by Katherine Johnson. Katherine Johnson was the woman who helped to launch NASA's program in the first place, and who just got credit for that. Yeah. So I think that we can do the same thing, and we're pulling together the brightest minds to shepherd that cause and hopefully inspire other people around the world to do the same thing.
Yeah. You just brought up the sort of idea of circular water treatment, right? And taking wastewater and making it drinkable again. And in an interview with us in January, you envisioned a future, maybe within the next 5 years, in which communities could deploy systems that do treat wastewater to drinking water quality. What makes you optimistic that this is achievable?
The fact that a year ago, hospitals were overwhelmed with COVID, and we didn't have a vaccine, and we have one now. If that can happen in a year because of the type of commitment and people wanted to find a solution, and we found one, I think if we have that same type of commitment to finding a sustainable solution to wastewater treatment, to where we can treat it to drinking water quality, we can find it within 5 years. I think actually sooner. But I believe that because COVID has taught us so many lessons, and there are people that have been getting in touch with us that are interested in being part of this new solution, I think that we're going to get there a lot quicker.
Where do you see the financing coming from for that sort of solution?
I think public-private partnerships will help develop this solution and help drive it. A lot of people from the academic community have reached out to us, and I know that as part of the American Jobs Plan, there's also money that's being proposed for research and development. So I think that we're at a good place to find what is needed to be able to move forward and come up with a prototype. And this time the difference would be, instead of trying to force it on communities, they'll be part of creating this solution so that they will already have a buy-in, because they will be at the table. And that's one of the differences in what we like to bring to this.
Yeah, you mentioned the American Jobs Plan, and that is the link with infrastructure projects, and much has been made of the idea that these wastewater treatment systems and recycling facilities too, big area that we haven't even touched on. They can create new jobs, but how do we balance that opportunity with questions of environmental justice and human health?
By having the people sitting at the table that are impacted. And one of the things that I have to give the administration credit for was organizing the first ever WEJAC, which is the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which I'm fortunate to be a part of, and to have people from across the country advising on the executive level, the government, on how to proceed in dealing with these issues. And 40% of the benefits from the American Jobs Plan has to go to these impacted and overburdened communities.
And just getting them at that table, is that all they need to do? Reach out? What other things can they do?
I think it's more than getting at the table. I think we should make sure that when the money does go to the community, that it goes to real solutions that the communities are part of selecting themselves, not federal bureaucrats, not connected engineering firms or businesses. and leave out the community and collect the money and leave. And when the infrastructure fails, they still left with trying to figure out what to do. So I think this is an opportunity where we can all have voices in the process, but also be part of selecting who gets the contracts, what type of infrastructure goes in place, and telling people what works and what does not work.
We've got to wrap up, but one final question for you. What final advice would you give to companies seeking to make a positive contribution to this challenge?
I think seeking partnerships and allowing people that are working on these projects to be able to lead. I think oftentimes what happens is that we're unintentionally going in and not listening, and because we want to help so bad and we feel like we have the solution and don't really understand what the problem is. And I've run into that quite a bit lately. So I think that for those that are willing to listen, I think that makes for a good, very good partner, and that works in all relationships, whether it's a relationship with a community or a relationship with one spouse or friend. One has to be willing to listen. And when the companies go into the communities, they're willing to let the people in the communities that live there, talk to them and listen to what they have to say. I think that they'll have better partnerships and also more sustainable solutions.
Catherine, thank you so much for taking time away from your mission to share your perspective.
Thank you so much for having me.
And with that, I'll hand back over to our Mistress of Ceremonies, Lauren Phipps.